Good afternoon, everybody. So I am Anantha Nageswaran, the new Chief Economic Advisor, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be joined by my colleagues from the Economics Division. The Economic Survey, as you know very well, for 21-22 has been compiled by my old friend and new colleague, Sanjeev Sanyal, and his team of advisors who are on either side of me. So naturally, they are going to be walking you through the economic survey and its key highlights. I would just point out that as a small preview, the overall theme of the economic survey, as has been the theme of the policies that the government has pursued, especially in these COVID years. The government has pursued a four-pronged approach: short-term support to the economy, especially to the vulnerable sections during these uncertain times, while keeping a firm eye on the medium-term fiscal stability. At the same time, never to let go of the opportunity that a crisis provides to initiate structural and supply-side reforms. The government has undertaken several measures as well. At the same time, as Sanjeev would walk you through, there has been considerable attention and emphasis on process reforms as well. So these are the four pillars of the government's approach in dealing with the COVID pandemic and also to prepare the economy for a post-pandemic world. So without much further ado, I would like to hand over the stage to my colleague, Sanjeev. Thank you.
Thank you, Anant. We'll now go to the presentation of the economic survey for 2021-22. Let me begin by thanking the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Honorable Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman for their unstinting support, without which, of course, this effort would not have been possible. I would also like to thank Ministers of State Pankaj Chaudhary, Minister of State Dr. Bhagwat Karat, Finance Secretary Dr. Somnathan, DEA Secretary Mr. Ajay Seth, Revenue Secretary Mr. Tarun Bajaj. An effort like this, as you can all imagine, meant that a large number of people contributed to this from across the government with all kinds of inputs. But of course, the bulk of the heavy lifting had to be done by the economic survey, which puts together this document. And I could not have done without the support of all the advisors on this table, Manisha, Chandni, Rajiv, and of course, all the officers and consultants of the economic division, and not just the ones that did the writing, but also the translators, those who did the design, the formatting, the administrative staff, all of whom were in office over the last few weeks till very late. And this has been a particularly difficult year to do this, as you can imagine, given the problems we had with Omicron. There were many members of our team who at different points were down with Omicron or some other illness, or had close family members who were affected. So there was many disruptions, and many people had to work from home in very difficult circumstances. So let me say that a very big thank you to all of you. Many of them are sitting right here in front of me, so if you can raise your hands and wave. Please, a big round of applause for them, because they put in a really big effort. Finally, let me welcome my dear friend, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, to the Ministry of Finance as the new Chief Economic Advisor. So a big round of applause for him as well. So, as many of you may have noticed, the economic survey has gone through another change in its format. We will be going for a different format, but it is important in this context to go through a very quick history of this document. So the Economic Survey as a document has its origins in the early 1950s when it started out as part of the budget papers. So it is not published separately, but as a part of the budget papers. And the earliest one that I could find is from 1957. It was a very short document, only 38 pages long. And it was basically a descriptive document. It had some recent trends, but not much by way of analysis and almost nothing by way of recommendations and so on. So it was a very simple document, but nevertheless, that's where it started out. You can see on the left image, one of the earliest ones that we have images for. This is the one from 5960. Now, through the course of the 60s, the document became a lot more substantial. A lot more data, charts, tables, etc. began to be added to it. You also began to have a Hindi translation at that stage of the 60s. And by about the early 70s, this became a more substantial document, about 150 odd pages. So you have on the right an image from 1973. Now, through the 70s and 80s, this document took a life of its own. It was by this time being presented as a separate document a day before the budget. So by now it has a character of its own. A lot more tables and charts are added. A statistical appendix is added in the end. And it begins to take on the form that is now much more familiar to what you would think of as an economic survey. I've got the one from 85, 86. Many people in this room will perhaps be familiar with that cover and may have studied it when in university. Now, the Economic Survey of 91-92, as you can imagine, was particularly awaited because that was during the crisis of 91, and you had the reforms and so on. And this is the first time that it appeared in 2 volumes. The first volume was a very thin volume, only about, if I remember, some 30-odd pages, but it was the first time that 2 volumes were published. The second volume was much more traditional sectoral analysis, but in the following years, it reverted to being back a single volume, but the document kept growing. And of course, with the advent of computers, the graphics and so on improved very dramatically. So by, as you can see, 2001, 2002, the covers become much more colorful and so on. Then during the global economic crisis, the document, a few extra thematic chapters were added to it by the then chief economic advisor, Dr. Arvind Vimani, perhaps to explain the predicament of that time. So you began to see a shift, somewhat of a shift from purely sectoral approach to adding more themes. And it became a longer document, certainly by 2011-12, that you have on the screen. It was by this point almost 500 pages long. Now, it then became split into 2 volumes in 2014, but that was a split in 2014 into a text volume, which was mostly done in a sectoral format, and a statistical appendix volume. So there was 2 volumes, but in this format. But in the subsequent years, it ended up with a volume 1 and a volume 2. The first volume tended to have thematic chapters, and the second had the more traditional chapters from the sectoral type chapters. That has now been changed in this economic survey, and this is what it looks like. There is a volume 1, or you can call it the text volume, the economic survey itself. That is the main volume, which we just released. But there is a second volume, which is the statistical appendix, and it's been given a character of its own. It's been refreshed. Many old tables have been removed. New tables have been added. For example, new kinds of data like GST, IGST, and so on have been added. There's a whole new section on high frequency indicators as well, in line with some of the thinking that I will now talk about. Now to the content of the economic survey of this year. Now, one of the clear points we make right up front in the survey is that there's been a revival of economic activity to pre-pandemic levels in the year 21-22. This shows through in the national accounts And it shows through a whole bunch of high frequency data that we have. I've just, for illustration, put the e-way bill collection, and you can see that there was a big contraction during the national lockdown last year, then a sharp revival, a more shallow slowdown during the second wave. So even though there was the health cost of the second wave was much more severe, the economic cost of it, by almost all accounts, was much milder, but there was an impact, and then a subsequent revival. So where does that leave us? Well, as you know from the advanced estimates, the economy this year is estimated to have grown by 9.2% after a contraction of 7.3% in the previous year. And you can see on the slide on the right that it is now a little bit above where it was in terms of economic activity, where it was before the pandemic. So in other words, we have now grown past the pre-pandemic level. What does it mean in terms by sector? This sectorally, we tend to look at it as a GVA, or gross value added perspective. And you can see what happened to different sectors. And the very last column is a comparison with the pre-pandemic era, which is 2019-20. And you will see that the agriculture sector, not surprisingly, this is the sector that was the least affected by lockdowns of various kinds. So this is a sector that grew even in 2021 and then again in 21-22. So in that sense, it is now a little short of 8% above where it was in pre-pandemic phase. The industrial sector did go through a contraction, but then it went through a significant revival as well. And now it is about 4.1% above pre-pandemic levels. And the subsectors went through a slightly different trends, but as you can imagine, the utility sector didn't go through the same kind of contraction because obviously water supply, electricity, etc. don't get shut down during a lockdown. But manufacturing, construction, and other such sectors did go through a contraction and then a revival. In fact, if you look at this, the quarterly data, they will go through this this downturn, sharp downturn, revival, shallow downturn, and flatter, then a more sustained revival. I scratched my head thinking about what would be a good letter of the alphabet to describe this. And after a lot of discussions with the best minds, we thought that the best we could do was maybe a tilted W. I know it's very awkward, but so didn't bother to use it. Now moving on to the services sector. Now the services sector is definitely the sector that was most affected by the lockdowns, and you can see that it is just a little short of where it was pre-pandemic. But I think the real story is not in the headline number, but in the subsectors. And you can see finance, real estate, professional services, or public administration. Both of these have actually gone back to pre-pandemic levels. But as you can imagine, the contact-intensive subsectors of services have been much more severely affected. And you can see that it is this segment, which includes, of course, tourism, travel, hotels, those kinds of sectors, that is still continues to be below pre-pandemic levels at about 91.5. So it's about 8.5% below where it was pre-pandemic. So this is clearly a sector that is still impacted. Overall, GVA at basic price is about 1.9% above where it was pre-pandemic. Now we can do the same exercise from the demand side, looking at real GDP growth, and you can again see that when you look at total consumption, it is just shy of where we were before the pandemic. Government consumption, of course, has been reasonably strong, not surprising, given a lot of spending that's happened, particularly on the health front, but on other kinds of things, including providing safety nets to vulnerable sections of society and of the business sector. So private consumption, on the other hand, still lags. Now, if you combine this private consumption number, which is at 97.1% of the pre-pandemic level, and the discussion in the previous slide, you can see where the hit really is, because this is all those contact-intensive services where obviously spending is constrained because you are under lockdowns of various kinds. In fact, we are just gone through one thanks to Omicron just in the last few weeks. Meanwhile, the gross fixed capital formation has recovered past the 1920 level. The key point here, of course, is that a lot of this is driven by government spending on capex, particularly on infrastructure, which we will also return to a little later in the fiscal segment that we will discuss. Exports have been a major driver of growth, and you can see they are now very significantly above the pre-COVID level. But of course, imports have also been very strong. Overall, GDP is 1.3% above where it was pre-pandemic. This is in line with what we saw calculating from the GVA perspectives. Now, of course, it's all very good for an economy to have recovered like this, but we continue to remain in uncertain times. There are geopolitical risks bubbling up in various parts of the world. Oil prices have spiked up just in the last few days. In fact, there's going to be very likely a withdrawal of global liquidity by major central banks, and that is something we have accounted for. So taking all these uncertainties into account, it is important to see whether our macroeconomic indicators can provide us a bit of a buffer through this recovery process. The first one we looked at was the fiscal performance. And you can see that the data that we have available for April to November 2021, which is the data that is publicly available with all of you, and it's not surprising from what you have probably been following anyway, that there has been a very sharp increase in both tax and non-tax revenue collections of the government. And it is not just the case that these collections are high on a year-on-year basis from the pandemic hit numbers of 2021. They are actually very significantly above what they were pre-pandemic as well. So this is real, genuine, boost to revenue collections of the government, which is great because this allows support for another leg of the government strategy, which is support for capital expenditure. And you can see that capital expenditure is now a level above where it used to be pre-pandemic. I mean, this was something that was ramped up very sharply through the second half of the last financial year as part of the demand push, but has, as you can see, been quite strong ever since. And so this is a very important part of the government strategy to both support demand on one side, but also create supply side assets for the future. Now, where does that leave various deficits? Well, as you can see, the numbers available for April to November, the estimates for the full year you will get tomorrow morning, but the publicly available numbers for April to November clearly show that the fiscal deficit is not only below what it was for last year for the same period, but also below what it was in the pre-pandemic phase in nominal rupee terms. This is also true, by the way, of the primary deficit, which is very substantial. It's half of what it was in the pre-pandemic period in rupee crore terms. So this is a very substantial correction. And of course, if you think of it in terms of percentage budget estimate, you can see that traditionally, because a lot of the revenue in India tends to be front-loaded, the fiscal deficit of the first half or the first in this case, April to November period, tends to be above the overall full year, and then in the course of the next few months, it comes down. But you can see that April to November 2021 has been particularly good, with numbers coming in at just 46% of the full year number. So this is a particularly good performance. Now moving on to the financial sector. Obviously, this is always an area of macroeconomic risk and stability that we need to look at. There were many commentators who had expressed the fear during the last 2 years that the financial system would become very stressed as a result of this shock, this pandemic-related shock. And you can see, however, that this sector actually has weathered it rather well. whether it's the gross NPA level or the net NPA level, both of them have continued to steadily decline through the last couple of years. And this is even true after the initial IBC moratorium was removed. So this has not gone through a spike after that. And the banks continue to increase their capital adequacy ratio. So they are becoming much more better capitalized. So this is important, that even if there's some later lagged impact of the pandemic on the economy, the banks are well capitalized, and they seem to have taken the pandemic shock in their stride. Now, of course, the financial sector is not just about stability, it's also about growth. And the last couple of years did see credit slow down significantly. But in the very latest numbers, you can see that it has begun to tick up again. But the good news is, because you have a banking system that is well capitalized, when the demand for credit arises, this banking system is in a position to provide that credit where appropriate. Also important to note how strong the capital markets have been. And you can see the amount of resource mobilization that has happened through IPOs through this year. In fact, just the April to December number is good enough to reach all-time records. So we've already crossed all-time records in the first 3/4 of the year. So not even taking the last 3 months, we are already in record territory. Now, of course, when people hear about this, they tend to have in their minds that what we are really talking about is all the big corporates or the unicorns that everybody likes talking about these days in the media. But the fact is, what you are witnessing here is a change in risk appetite and animal spirits in the economy, which is very much widespread across the country and at every level, and particularly showing through in this field of startups. So here I have two maps. The one on the left is just from 5 years ago. It shows new startups in India as of the year 2016-17. These are not just any company that happen to have been established. These are companies registered with DPIIT as startups using certain criteria. So they are proper startups. And you can see in the year 16-17, there were these few sort of concentrations near Bangalore, Hyderabad area. There was one concentration near Mumbai, and then one in the Delhi NCR area. But most of the country really didn't have a startup culture. Now, 5 years later, that has completely changed. And this is, by the way, data as on 22nd of December. We have not even finished the year. And you can see a complete change. There are at least 555 districts in the country with at least one startup. This is quite incredible. And you can see it's scattered across the country. There's obviously the usual suspects, Delhi NCR area. There is Mumbai, Pune area. There's another hub near Ahmedabad. And I mentioned Bangalore. But you can see that there are hubs all across the country, whether it's even near Patna and Lucknow, there are startups popping up, and even in parts of the country that, not historically associated with startup culture. You can see even in the Northeast, there are several of them popping up. So this is a real change in some ways in the animal spirits at a grassroots level. Now to move on to the next stability indicator. This is the external sector. Again, the balance of payments remained in a healthy positive territory throughout this episode. There were obviously ups and downs on individual segments, whether it's the current account or the capital account. But overall, even during the difficult times of the lockdown, when the capital flows may have been a little volatile, the current account moved into a large surplus in the first quarter of 2021. And since then, of course, capital flows have been doing very well. And although the current account has moved into a small deficit because of a revival in imports, which is natural. If your economy revives, your imports will also revive, and oil prices too. But you can see that capital flows have been so strong that we have a very healthy balance of payments surplus throughout the period. And this has allowed for an accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. We are now at about 634 billion reserves, one of the highest in the world, and equivalent to about 13.2 months of imports. So very, very comfortable. you compare it with whether our external debt servicing requirements or any other ratios, you will see we are very, very comfortable on the external front. Now to move to inflation. Now inflation, as you can imagine, during the year 2021 was very much reflected the disruptions caused by the lockdowns, the supply chain disruptions. So not surprisingly, the supply chain disruptions meant the CPI went up, whereas piling up of inventory at the wholesale meant that actually went into negative territory. So since things were opened up into this year, you saw the CPI come back into the tolerance band, and it remains in the tolerance band as of the latest reading of at 5.6%. But the WPI has popped back up and is in double digits. Now, some of that, of course, is a reflection of the low base from last year. So that will, of course, wear itself out. But we do need to be concerned here in India about the fact that there is significant imported inflation, particularly from energy prices, that will be something we need to watch out for. Now, as part of the economic survey, we did some analysis of things that very often become matters of debate quite often, which is tomato and onion prices. And you can see why that is the case, because tomato and onion prices, and those of potatoes as well sometimes, go through these massive spikes. So the question is, why do they go through these massive spikes? And so we did a little bit of analysis here, and we found something quite interesting. First of all, this one is for tomatoes. There is a lot of seasonality in all of this. And you can see that during the months of February, March, April, the prices of tomatoes decline every year. And then in the months of July, August, and then another spike somewhere in October, November, they go up. And every year this becomes a matter of debate. This is a cyclical trend because of the harvesting cycle, and we should be able to see through it in different ways. In addition to that, you also have irregular components in terms of weather shocks. So there is a section in the economic survey. Please read it for those who are interested in this. We have something similar also for onion prices. And you can see there is a lot of seasonality here as well. Every year it goes down during the months of April, May, June, and you will see farmers complaining. And then later in the year when it goes up, consumers complaining about this. And again, of course, the weather shocks also play an important role in all of this. Of course, the solution to that, this is to develop the supply chains that and cold storage facilities that can smoothen this out, and not to mention financial instruments that can allow for futures so that we can smoothen these things out. But just to show you why this happens every year. Now, this is something that will not be of any surprise. An important risk factor these days, a macroeconomic risk factor these days, is waves of COVID pandemic that seems to come through. So not surprisingly, vaccination status is actually a macroeconomic stability indicator. And you can see that we have done rather well over the last year. And this data is as of 16th of January, because that marked a full year cycle. And you can see that we have done rather well in terms of percentage of adult population with the first dose. We have now crossed 93%. Percentage of adult population with second dose was about 70% at the time of writing. This is moving so fast that by now this has already moved on from this. Now, it is traditional that we present an outlook and a forecast for the next financial year. So the growth for 2022-23, we argue in the economic survey, will be supported by widespread vaccination coverage, gains from a large number of supply-side reforms, easing of regulations, robust export growth, availability of fiscal space to ramp up capital spending, and so on. And so we expect that there will be a fairly robust growth into the next year, and we forecast that India's GDP will grow in real terms by 8 to 8.5% in 22-23. Now, this projection is based on a bunch of assumptions. All projections are always based on some assumptions, and it's important to be absolutely transparent about what they are. So what we have said here, that one assumption is that there will be no further debilitating pandemic-related economic disruption. So you may get next waves, but there will be no debilitating lockdowns. That's an assumption. We assume a normal monsoon. We do allow for significant withdrawal of global liquidity by major central banks, although we hope that they will be broadly orderly, but there will be a withdrawal of such liquidity. Oil prices in the range of 70 to 75. Now, somebody may say that, how can you assume this when oil prices are at 90? Well, just remind you that just 18 months ago, it was below 20. So we have put what we thought was a reasonable assumption. And of course, the global supply chain disruptions will remain in play for much of the next financial year, but will slowly ease towards the end. So we do allow for significant disruptions to continue for much of next year, but easing over time. Now, just to put it in the context of some of the international forecasts that came through, the latest one came from the IMF just 5 days ago. And you can see, first of all, that India is one of the very few countries where, in fact, pretty much almost the only country where the forecast has been increased. Their forecast for that year went up from 8.5 to 9.0. This is in the context, as you can see, very substantial reductions for almost every other country. I would also like to note here that even with our more conservative forecasts from the economic survey, we would still be the world's fastest growing economy. Now, as the point that we have made so far, the economy is in a good place to grow strongly into the next year or two, and all the macro stability indicators suggest that there is a fair amount of buffer. So how did we manage to do this? What was unique about our policy strategy? And here I would like to highlight something that we talked about briefly in the last economic survey, which is a barbell strategy. Why? What is this all about? Well, when you're living in an extremely uncertain environment, it is very difficult because there are a lot of unpredictable things happening. So how do you deal with an extremely uncertain, unpredictable environment? How do you make policy in this environment? So we have argued that one good way of doing this is to use something that is used commonly in finance, incidentally, something called barbell strategy, where basically what you do is you combine two opposite legs, very disparate legs, that you highlight. Yeah. Let me add to that. There are many segments of the economy that have got a lot of strong momentum, not the least exports, particularly services exports are doing particularly well, and we do talk about that in the economic survey. I mentioned earlier, we have well-capitalized banking system, and we've also had particularly good year in terms of the monies raised through the primary markets, the capital markets, which can now be leveraged up by a banking system that is in a good position. We have a fiscal environment where the resources are there we discussed that about revenues being quite strong, both tax and non-tax revenues. So things are conducive for getting momentum. And of course, an important part of this has got to be to open up contact intensive services, where the problem really is the pandemic and obviously our resilience to it. And that is why I mentioned that vaccination is such an important part of our macroeconomic strategy. And we seem to be doing very well on that front as well. So that is why in our forecast we have, and I think it's a reasonable assumption, that while you may have subsequent waves of the pandemic, I'm not a health expert, it may happen, but I think it's fair assumption that they will not be quite as disruptive as earlier waves. I think most people will think is a reasonable way to think about it.
175.
Good evening, sir. My name is Shishir from Hindu Business Line. Sir, I have two questions. It seems that you are very conservative in growth projection for the next fiscal. And the second question is about the oil prices. You mentioned about that 18 months back, we had $20 a barrel price, and now it is $90 a barrel. It appears that the prices may not go down below 80 or $80 a barrel during the next 6 months or so. So in that situation, what kind of growth projection we can have from the current level?
See, we are not in the business of predicting global oil prices. As you can imagine, they are very volatile, as you all know. And just 18 months ago, as you said, that it was down to 20. Now it's at 19. So it is a volatile number. We have taken what we think is a reasonable number looking at what the statements of IEA and so on. And so I think this is where we think is a reasonable assumption. This is not a forecast of where oil prices will be. This is an assumption that we have fed into our calculations. And if you have a different forecast, you are very welcome to use that into your calculations. But we think that this is a reasonable assumption.
But also to supplement what Sanjeev said, $70 to $75 per barrel assumption made in the economic survey is an average price range. So we have at the moment, yes, of course, the current financial year is not over yet. We have $90. But by the time we get into April of the next financial year, thanks to the monetary policies and tightening of global liquidity and potential for growth slowdown in the developed world, as you might have noticed, the IMF has indeed lowered the growth forecast for developed world, for the whole world, by 0.5 percentage to 4.4. So to that extent, that will also moderate demand for oil. So whether $90 is a price that is going to prevail for the rest of the new financial year is an assumption. And the price range of 70 to 75 is an average price assumption made for the new financial year. And I think that's a realistic assumption to be made.
We'll have to move on to the next.
Okay, number 19.
Hi, sir. I'm Meghna Mittal from Newsrise. The survey does talk about the high trade deficit that we have been experiencing due to high imports for past 4 months. What is your outlook on the continuing high trade deficit, because the disruptions will be continuing, and its impact on the rupee? And do you think the government needs to take some immediate steps to tackle it?
So you have to see that both exports and imports have recovered very, very strongly. And in fact, if anything, the exports would have been even stronger, but for the fact that there is a shortage, as you know, of containers and other things. So it is not the case that there is just a boom in imports and this is causing it. The import boom is happening partly because our economy is recovering as strongly as it is, and also because many of these are re-exported as well. So it's a part of the supply chain, it's part of our revival in the economy, and overall the deficit, the current account is what we really care about. That is not expanding out very quickly because services exports are also doing exceptionally well, as you know. We are, in fact, every day in the newspapers, you'll read about how our IT and BPO sector and software sector are having difficulties actually hiring people because of the expansion they are seeing. So what we really care eventually about from the balance of payments perspective is how the current account is doing. And the current account is actually moved from a small surplus in 2021 to a small deficit in 21-22, which is very well within what we normally see. And of course, with capital flows being quite sustained, including from FDI, I don't think there's a financing issue of any kind. And I think there's not just about that. Even if there is a withdrawal, a tapering that is very likely to happen, I mentioned that, we have taken that into our calculations. And I think we are well placed with the amount of reserves we have to be able to buffer any flows that we may see from the tapering.
58.
सर मेरा नाम आलोक प्रियदर्शी है, सीएनबी सेवा से। सर मेरा सवाल ये है कि आपने जैसे अपने चार्ट में बताया कि खासतौर से सर्विस सेक्टर अभी भी प्री कोविड लेवल से उभरा नहीं है, सबसे ज्यादा जॉब्स प्रोवाइड करने वाला भी सेक्टर एक है, वो वहाँ के लिए क्या स्ट्रेटेजी होनी चाहिए? और जॉब्स की सिचुएशन जो इस वक्त चल रही है, सरकारी सेक्टर्स बहुत ज्यादा जॉब प्रोवाइड नहीं कर रहे हैं, प्राइवेट सेक्टर पे ही उम्मीद है, और ऐसे में ये जो स्थिति है सर्विस सेक्टर की, उसको लेकर क्या आगे आने वाले दिनों में सरकार की स्ट्रेटेजी होनी चाहिए और क्या किस तरह से इस समस्या का समाधान होना चाहिए?
तो पहले मैं कहूंगा कि जो आप सेवा क्षेत्र के बारे में जो आप कह रहे हैं, उसमें मैंने दिखाया कि जो फाइनेंस, रियल एस्टेट और पब्लिक एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन के जो सब सेक्टर्स हैं, उन क्षेत्रों में तो आपको दिख रहा है कि रफ्तार है। समस्या है जो कॉन्टैक्ट इंटेंसिव जो सेवाएं हैं, जो टूरिज्म ले लीजिए, एंटरटेनमेंट ले लीजिए, रेस्टोरेंट वगैरह, और बार बार ये जो ओमिक्रॉन वगैरह अभी जो लहर भी आया है, तो ये महामारी के कारण इन स्वास्थ्य के जो हमारे कारण हम लोगों को जो बार बार ये लॉकडाउन और रेगुलेशन करना पड़ा है, तो स्वाभाविक है कि ये जो कॉन्टैक्ट इंटेंसिव सेवाएं हैं उनमें तो कुछ प्रभाव पड़ा ही है। तो अंत में हाँ, इनको कुछ सुविधाएं हमने दी हैं, हमने लिक्विडिटी सपोर्ट वगैरह वैसे किए हैं, लेकिन अंत में हमको इन सेवाओं को खोल देना पड़ेगा। और इसीलिए हम लोगों ने शुरू में ही कहा कि एक बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण चीज़ है कि वैक्सीनेशन का जो हम लोगों ने जो पूरा जो प्रक्रिया की देखा है आपने पिछले 1 साल से, और जितना इसमें हम लोगों को सफलता मिली है, ये बहुत ही ज़रूरी है, क्योंकि जब तक ये लहरें आती रहेंगी और उसका जो स्वास्थ्य को लेके जो हमारी जो समस्या रहेंगी, तब तक इन क्षेत्रों को हम खोल नहीं सकते। हम इनको जितना भी बाहर से जितना भी आप इसको सपोर्ट दीजिए, लेकिन अंत में तो खोलना ही पड़ेगा ना। तो खोलने के लिए हम लोगों को ये जो स्वास्थ्य को लेके जो हमारी जो समस्याएं हैं, उनको हमको एक मद्देनजर रखते हमको फिर हम लोगों को जो खोलने का अवसर मिलेगा। मुझे आशा है कि अब आने वाले इस वित्तीय साल में हम लोग इसको बरकरार रख पाएंगे, क्योंकि अब तो जानते ही हैं कि अब जो अभी ओमिक्रॉन में भी जितना जिसका प्रभाव पड़ा है, मोटा मोटी पहले वेव से कहीं कम पड़ा है। तो मैं कहूँगा वैक्सीनेशन हुआ है, कुछ हद तक हर्ड इम्यूनिटी भी हुआ होगा शायद। तो सब मिला के मैं कहूँगा कि हमारा ये मतलब फोरकास्ट में जो हम लोगों ने सोचा है, और वही है कि इन सेवाओं का खोल देने का हम लोगों को अवसर मिलेगा।
Okay, 107.
Yeah, good evening to everybody. I'm Siddharth from Bloomberg. Just wanted to ask, you made those interesting enumerations to those plotting of maps. So would it also be interesting to see if you could plot how many people were unemployed in 2011 in comparison to today, or people who died of hunger, or people who sleep without food in the country, something like that.
So the economic survey does look into the issue of employment, if that is what you are asking about. So as you know, there is a dearth of good official unemployment data, which is real time. There is one, but it comes with a very significant lag. So what we do know from the official surveys, the detailed surveys, that there was a significant decline in employment during the original lockdown, and then a very significant revival up to about March. After that, there was some impact, of course, from the second wave, but the large survey does not, data is not yet available. So we have to use proxies. So what are the proxies we can use? So for the purposes of the economic survey, we have here, for example, one of the proxies is EPFR data. So we know that EPFR data, we have seen a very sharp increase in recent months. Now, some of it is formalization, but there is a significant amount of new job creation that is also happening in there. And remember, these are not for high-end jobs. So this is not, I'm not talking about high job packages for IIT graduates. This is definitely, EPFO is for, for formal, but bottom of the formal pyramid jobs. And that is clearly recovering. The other indicator that we have considered here is looking at Manrega numbers. And so there, as you know, that's a reasonable way of gauging job demand in the rural segment. So basically what we saw, there's a big spike during the lockdown. Then it comes back also very, very significantly. It does not quite go back in the same way during the second wave, which is again fits the other high frequency data we saw, and then it filters down again. However, it is still above where it was pre-pandemic. And you will see that in the chapter 10, which is the social chapter, we discussed this extensively. So Manrega demand, yes, it has come down very substantially from the peak, certainly below where it was last year, but still above, a little bit above where it was pre-pandemic. In this context, very often, one of the presumptions one has is that this stress would therefore be perhaps in the migrant sourced states and least in the migrant recipient states, because that is how we would usually think about it. So we actually went and looked at the state level Manrega data as well. And there we found something very interesting, that this is not actually a systematic trend. We found that there are many source states for migrants which are actually doing better now on Manrega than they were pre-COVID, like Bihar, for example. And there are some recipient states like Maharashtra and Punjab, which are actually doing worse. Now, why that is the case is a subject that somebody should research. But I'm just pointing out to you that a simplistic interpretation of the Manrega data may not lead you to the right conclusion.
Okay, 105.
सर आपने प्राइवेट सेक्टर की और गवर्नमेंट सेक्टर में सर क्यों नहीं जॉब क्रिएशन हो रहा? आपने कहा कि जो देश, बेंगलोर में आपने मेट्रो का जिक्र किया, प्रॉपर्टीज का किया, दिल्ली में किया, इतना ज्यादा बढ़ोतरी हो रही है, लेकिन गवर्नमेंट जॉब्स में बढ़ोतरी नहीं हो रही है। अभी आपने रिसेंटली देखा रेलवे में 1.5 करोड़ लोग अप्लाई कर रहे हैं, तो कोई लिमिट होता है सर कि कितना बेरोजगारी इस देश में है? उसके ऊपर कोई आपका सर्वे है कि गवर्नमेंट जॉब क्यों नहीं क्रिएशन हो रहा?
So let me say that I can't obviously comment on that specific incident. That's not my mandate. The key here is that is the public sector generating jobs? Now, first of all, let me point out that there are many areas where the public sector is generating jobs. It may not be as government jobs. When you're talking about capital expenditure on infrastructure, that is also a government job being created by government spending. It may not that the contractors, workers may not be government employees. So there is that kind of job being created. And then, support jobs like Manrega, etc., are also forms of government jobs. But of course, yes, there's always been the case that there is a lot of demand for regular government jobs in India. This is not a new phenomenon, incidentally. And such incidents, by the way, have happened in the past as well before COVID type situation. So there's been an attraction in India for regular government jobs. And we have always heard, even in my childhood, that so many lakh people apply for so many few number of jobs. So this is not a new phenomenon at all. But yes, I mean, there are a large number of vacancies in government, you're right, and they get filled every year. But let me just, since many people always come up with this number, X lakh number of jobs in the government sector, you get the impression that those are 8 lakh jobs and they're never being filled. That's not the case. Those are different jobs. Those 8 lakhs get filled and another 8 lakhs appears because it's a large institution and they're continuously churning. So be careful about taking a headline number and just interpreting it that they're not getting filled. That's not the case. People are retiring, people are leaving their jobs, new kinds of jobs are being, so there's a continuous churn going on. So please don't interpret these headline numbers as static numbers.
110.
This is Ujjwal Narayan from Newsrise. Sir, my question is, you have talked about high inflation because wholesale price inflation is around 6%. Wholesale price inflation is in 2 digits and consumer price index is around 6%. So what is your outlook in the next financial year for the inflation? And do you see the need of monetary tightening to keep inflation tapped? And also, you see any impact on of global inflation or import of global inflation on your numbers which you have projected?
So as you can imagine, I have to be careful answering this question without tripping into the Monetary Policy Committee's space. But let me say that we have now a well-established band for almost the entire time that we have been in this. We have been using this inflation targeting. The Monetary Policy Committee and the RBI have been able to keep it within that band. We've actually been very successful at doing this. And even as we speak, despite the spikes in inflation worldwide, our inflation at least is still within the tolerance threshold. So let me first point out that this is something that we have done successfully. Now, you're absolutely right. And I also pointed it out in my survey that the international situation is clearly in an environment where there are all kinds of pressures, particularly from oil prices, but otherwise as well with all kinds of supply side shocks, chip shortages, etc. Transportation, cargo tariffs, etc. They are all high, and so these do have an impact. We are a part of the world. Imported inflation is an issue, and we do need to take that into account. But also remember, the rest of the world is also in some ways responding to it. It's not like they are not doing it as well. While on one hand, the tapering is a problem from a financial flows perspective, it does presumably, the whole purpose of it is to temper inflationary pressures. Similarly, there is a lot of discussion, a lot of effort being put in worldwide in trying to ease up all these supply side problems with chips and so on. Even we are trying to set up chip factories. And in fact, one of the problems with these kinds of things is commodity cycles. One of the reasons you have commodity cycles is that you get spike in prices, a lot of capacity is built, and then these things come crashing down. So don't think of these things in linear fashion. There is a problem with imported inflation, but don't begin to sort of extrapolate this into the future, that today oil is 90, therefore it will eternally keep going back. The reason I mentioned that so recently back it was so low, it was below 20. So recently, just to point out to you that these are, very high volatility numbers.
Yeah, number 11.
Good evening, sir. Rishti here from Bloomberg News. What does the geospatial data show about India's recovery from the pandemic, and how strongly does that correlate with other high-frequency indicators and GDP data?
So one of the things that you have to be careful is that this data is still very new. Many of this data, first generation that we are using it. So you have there is as much art in interpreting this data as there is in science. But yes, if you look at, for example, our high frequency indicators, one of the indicators that is there is the mobility indicators, the Google mobility indicators. We actually publish them. There are also things like PMI, there are digital transactions data that is being picked up. So all of this data, with obviously the caveat that I mentioned, we do look at them as part of our high frequency indicators. And most of them suggest the same tilted W cycle, sharp decline, sharp recovery, a shallower decline, and then a sustained recovery. Some of them, because they are very, very high frequency, we even can see that Omicron did cause some disruption in the last few months, but that seems to be now petering out.
71.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Manoj Kumar from Reuters News Agency. First, want to congratulate new CA and your team for presenting a wonderful economic survey this year. And instead of having too much optimistic numbers like last year, when we were talking about V-shaped recovery, 11% growth for this year. So number seems to be more realistic this year. Glass is half full. You have already explained through various charts and various numbers. So if you permit me, considering that you are the topmost economist in our government, and you would be transparent and honest to give the answers for those people as well, for which glass is still not half full. As you presented that, particularly for our private consumption and content-based services are still below this pre-pandemic level, and which probably is more than 60% of our economy's part. So what do you see particularly when this thali economics that we were talking about last time, for those people for which the cost of thali has gone up by nearly 10% in the last 2 years, looking at this rise in energy prices, LPG prices, this mustard oil, this tea prices. So in the last 2 years, when their incomes are still below this pre-pandemic level, and you also talk about that there is government still has a lot of fiscal space, looking at this April to November rise in revenue collections by nearly 67%. So what do you see, so what could be done for those sections? And secondly, supplementary question is that when for the corporate sector, for the corporate sector, we had given for those people now. Thank you.
I thought you were giving a lecture.
I think if I understood the question correctly, the government is one of the reasons the presentation dwelt at length on the supports being given to the vulnerable sections, whether it's in terms of the Minister's Awas Yojana, PMAY and the Jal Jeevan Mission, and also the Garib Kalyan Yojana disbursements. All of this is to accept and acknowledge the stress that the pandemic has caused and to ameliorate it to the extent possible, as well as the emergency credit line guarantee scheme for the micro and small and medium enterprises. So these are all the various sets of comprehensive action that the government has taken to support the lower income categories, whether in terms of enterprises or in terms of households. Naturally, it will take time for them to regain confidence, because the slowdown in consumption spending is not only a function of the lack of income growth, but also because of the uncertainty caused by the pandemic and the health impacts, etc. So once the pandemic cloud itself is lifted and many of the contact services come back into their pre-pandemic level, as you know very well, the construction sector is beginning to revive, and that is one of the highest employment elasticities in the country. And those things would then have a virtuous circle in terms of job creation, income growth, and therefore the consumption share of GDP, which is about 97% compared to the pre-pandemic level, especially in the second half of the new financial year, it should come back into stream, assuming that the subsequent impacts of the pandemic turns out to be milder and milder, and we no longer have waves, but only some trickles and flash floods and so on. So more than the economic factors, we should also consider the fear and sentiment. And once those things get lifted, we hope that along with the various measures that the government has taken and private sector capex also kicking in, we will go into a virtuous circle of income generation and employment generation. Thank you.
Let me add to this. The economic survey actually speaks extensively about this issue. And may I draw your attention to table 5, which is a very long table because it goes and runs into 4 pages, where we have listed the large numbers of policies that were put in place as safety net for preventing precisely the issues that you mentioned. Whether it's cash transfers, food security, employment, housing, skill development, MSMEs, credit, and so on. And not only have we listed them, we've also provided there's a running along on the side, what exactly were the outcomes of those efforts. So it's not only what was done, but what happened, how much money was actually disbursed or whatever it is. So if it's of interest, please do read table 5.
Number 5. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. My name is Karishma. I'm from Business Today TV India Today Group. Firstly, congratulations to all of you. My question is that cryptocurrency is turning out to be this new dimension in the global economy. Now, while of course IMF has expressed deep reservations on it, as prominent Indian economist to the Indian government, could you tell us what is your stance on this and how can cryptocurrency play a role in the Indian economy?
Okay. First of all, we have not covered the economic survey. We have not covered the cryptocurrency issue in the economic survey. As you know very well, this is a matter of some debate, both inside the government and the Ministry of Finance, and even in Parliament. So this is something that is currently in discussion. We understand the various issues around that have also been highlighted by the Reserve Bank about the financial stability impacts of this. We can also see it in other countries like El Salvador, for example, who have adopted Bitcoin. So there are some financial stability issues, but there are also other arguments that are made in terms of innovation and so on. And this is obviously a balanced view on this will be taken. So this is not something that we have, not something we have covered in the economic survey, and I'm not quite in a position to comment on what the current thinking is, because that's still evolving.
Number 3.
Sir, you mentioned last year GVA industrial growth is -7%, and then this year you mentioned and it will be 11.8. This V-shape growth, do you think it is nearer to reality?
So the data is very clear on this, and whether it's the national accounts data or you see the data from the high frequency data, the trends are almost exactly the same. The lockdown did have a very large impact on everybody other than agriculture and a few utilities. Very sharp down, very sharp revival into the second half of the last financial year, 2021. Then some disruption which happens because of the second wave, which causes, obviously, the health impact of that was quite severe. Many of you will have personally impacted by this. But the economic impact of that was more shallow. There was an impact, but much more shallow. And then a more sustained recovery that is followed through. Now, there may have been some implications even for a week or two because of Omicron. But my own sense is the indicators mostly show that it was also even more shallow. There was some impact, particularly on those specific contact-based services, but very shallow impact. So the momentum really remains quite strong. As I said, given that this is the shape, you can decide what letter of the alphabet you prefer to use for it.
Thank you, friends. We close the press conference now. I wish to thank the Chief Economic Advisor and the Principal Economic Advisor and their team for the excellent presentation. Thank you.